Mm. Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to Database 3, where we are going to talk about PostgreSQL with Django, and we are going to briefly talk about relationship, and then we are going to move on to talk about user authentication and session. And this is a very, very practical lecture, which we'll be going through some coding that can guide you along how do you use Django spelling user authentication system. So yeah. And before diving into authentication, actually, let's just briefly talk about relationship because database relationship is actually a pretty important topic. So first of all, what's database relationship? It's kind of like an association between different tables. Um, you might learn about one-to-one relationship, one-to-many, and man-to-many in your math class, where you learn about, for instance, bijection. So here in database, the world of database is something that's very, very similar. So for instance, one-to-one is that both tables can only have one record on each side of the relationship. So first of all, relationship describe like a relationship between two different tables. This is like one very important point to know. And also, for a one-to-one relationship, each primary key value relates to none or only one record in the related table. Let's actually look at an example here. So here's a one-to-one relationship between those two tables. We can see that the personal here has an employee ID as their like primary key, and here payroll also has has employee ID as the primary key. As we can see, employee 110 has like only one entry here in personal, and as a result, it only has one entry here in the payroll, and that's a one-to-one relationship. Essentially, it's saying that each employee will only have one payroll, and each payroll will only have like apparently one employee, and each employee cannot have like two payroll. This is a one-to-one relationship. And also there's one-to-many relationship. So one-to-one relationship is essentially like mapping one thing to one thing. So one-to-many is you can map one thing to many things. So here's another example of here's an example of one-to-many relationship between the customers and the orders database. As you can see here, the customer 20151 here has been mapped twice. Oops. Here and here. So customer 20151 has two order numbers. As a result, it has actually two entries in the orders table. And this is a one-to-many relationship. Essentially, it's like one customer can order multiple orders. However, like one order cannot be mapped to multiple customers. Essentially, like an order cannot be ordered twice by like different people, because that doesn't really make sense. So this is a one-to-many relationship. And finally, we also have many-to-many relationship. So many-to-many relationship is that, so it's also a relationship between two databases. And let's actually just look at an example database. Yeah, so here it's an employees database and also a projects database. So this is a many-to-many relationship because one employee can work on multiple projects and one project can be worked on by multiple employees at the same time. So for instance, working around the house is work done by 3 employees, as you can see here, by the employee ID and also employee 26. They're working on both the sport of hang gliding and also the work working around the house. So this is a man-to-man relationship where like both databases can map to many entries. So how do we actually write them in PostgreSQL? is fairly simple. So for instance, if we have a one-to-many relationship, simply add models.one-to-many field and then followed by the database name. So for instance, if we have like a class tutorial, model, and the tutorial has, for instance, a description, char field, and then something else. And you can simply build a relationship between the author and the tutorial database by using one-to-many field. And then after you use this, the tutorials object will store a list of unique ID of like each tutorial that the author has written. So for instance, if I am the author and I have written like 3 tutorials, then the tutorials will be a list containing the 3 unique ID of the tutorial. And this is a way for the database to reference back to itself. So this is how you write a one-to-many field. And it's the same for one-to-one field and also many-to-many field. But for many-to-many field, you actually need to include like the many-to-many field on this side as well, because it's a many-to-many relationship. So yeah, that's for the relationship in Django. Are there any questions? Cool. Okay, now let's switch gear and talk about user authentication. So user authentication is like one of the most commonly used thing in like industry. I mean, because like almost every website needs a user login system, so they are very important. And how do developers approach user authentication? Is usually by leveraging the power of already existing packages. Because if you want to write a user authentication from scratch, it's pretty difficult. And Django provides us with a very powerful authentication package called Authentication, which you can simply use within Django, and we will demonstrate this in a moment as well. And before we go into like how do we implement things, let's actually go through some concepts. So there are mainly 2 types of authentication. One is session-based authentication and one is token-based authentication. So what's a session-based authentication? So for a session-based authentication, a session is generated when you try to log into a website. Sometimes you will see like sessions expired shown by some website when you like fail to log in. This is I think it will actually be shown on Cal Central as well. But this is essentially like a session-based authentication. So how does session-based authentication work? Is that it will generate a session ID and then the ID will be stored in a cookie. And then after login, the server will validate the credential, which is like the username and user password. And after, if the user's name and password is correct, it will generate a session. And then the database will actually store the session and also send the session ID back to the browser, which means that the browser can store the session ID as a cookie. And afterwards, when the user tries to log in again, the browser can simply send the session ID to the server. And then the server will check the session ID with the session that is stored. If the session ID matches the session that is stored, then it will allow the user to log in. And this is like session-based authentication. And people might ask, why do we do session-based authentication when we can simply like check their password? This is usually because of, first of all, this is mainly because of time complexity issue. So usually for us to store a password, we will hash that password. Hashing is a very, very time consuming, like compared to a simple comparison, hashing is a pretty time consuming procedure, especially for password hashes. And as a result, if we try to like perform hashes every time when a user tries to log in, it takes quite a lot of time. Also, like indexing and searching in database also takes time. As a result, simply comparing the session ID with the already stored session is much easier. And this is simply a graph that showing how the session works. The user first sends a post request to the login API, and then server generates the session ID and send it back. And then when the client tries to log in again, they can simply send the session cookie, which is also like the session ID, and then the server compares the session ID with the cookie, and then do accordingly. So yeah. And session ID is stateful, which means that for every time a request is made, a lot of information is being stored both on the browser and also on the server. And this is session-based authentication. And there's also token-based authentication. It's relatively new, and but it's pretty useful. So essentially, how token-based authentication work is that the server. So first of all, the user will also log in, and then the server will validate with a credential, and then it will generate a token from user data, and it will send it back. And the token will also be stored in browser, and then the client can add the token to the header, and then make a request to the server again, and then the server will validate the token. As you can see, the session-based and the token-based actually seems very similar. So what's the difference between session-based authentication and token-based authentication? The main thing is that token-based authentication is stateless, which means that the browser doesn't need to store any extra things. And token is often like parsed by a special parser, and then the browser can directly validate the user's credentials this way, instead of like storing a session ID and comparing it with a session. So that's the main difference between a token-based authentication and the session-based authentication. And I would say in practice, you won't worry about how to use token-based versus how to use session-based so much, because you're just going to use packages. And those packages will neatly handle this for you. So yeah, but this is just nice to know. The main takeaway is that the token-based is stateless and session-based is stateful. So yeah. Any questions so far? Cool. Okay, now let's go into the exciting stuff where we are going to implement a user authentication system with Django. And before we get started, we actually have something pretty fun for this lecture. So essentially, instead of like doing a regular Postman thing, where we test out whether we can log in based on Postman, we've actually have a front end. So this is a pretty practical problem that backend engineers will face in their like daily work. So the front engineer will give you like for instance, here is a website that the front engineer has already built. However, the username and the password system hasn't already built. Right now, it's just pretty dummy. And what we need to do is to build a user authentication system that allows user to log in and also log out and check stuff in between. So that's our goal. And now let's get started with the implementation. So first of all, we create a new directory for our project. And this is just pretty standard stuff. So we already have some front-end code in place, as you can see. All the front-end code is located in this front-end folder underneath like the Django user live folder. And so the Django user live folder will be this Django React templates folder. And yeah, and we will work within this project. So first of all, let's get started with creating a Django project. And let's go ahead and create our app. So after we create our Django project and create our app, as we can see, we have, first of all, the Django project here. Also, we have a manage.py, which we already talked about during the last lecture. And we also have an API, which is our app that we have created just now. And as you might discover, we actually didn't need to use a Django. We actually didn't need to use a PostgreSQL database. That's because Django will actually do the user authentication for us. So I guess it's not really PostgreSQL with Django for this lesson. I mean, we do talk about relationship, but for user authentication, we don't actually need PostgreSQL because Django has a user authentication system that's stored like in the file system itself, which means that it's stored on the server, which is pretty neat. So yeah, and now let's get started. Okay, so this is our code. So first of all, let's actually add our app we have just created into the installed app, which is something that we have also done in the previous lesson. Essentially, after you add in the Django, we'll look at the API.apps, and then it will import everything in properly. And our app is going to have the following endpoint to support the front-end website. So we'll have API/login /logout/session, and the session is essentially to use that check whether a session exists. Also a who am I feature, just for the front end to use, as you will see later. And now let's go on and try to implement all the view code. Where is it? Okay, let's copy. So for the views, we're going to put it here. So for all the views, we're going to put inside the API app. And then let's look at each view. So as you can see, we have 4 views here: login, logout, session, and who am I. And login is pretty standard. So first of all, it takes in the data. And notice that although the Django will handle authentication by itself, you still need to like process all the data. So how will you process this? First of all, you get the data from the request body. And essentially what this will do is that the front end will send you a body full of like username and also password. In this case, we are actually sending like the password by its like its actual form. For instance, if your password is like 12345, it will actually be sent in as 12345 because this is a pretty dummy user authentication system. But what you can do is use some hash function in the front end, and then this way we can ensure that when we are transmitting the password is actually properly hashed. But hashing is like a whole different topic, which we can talk about in another day. So yeah, right now we can just store password as it is. So yeah, we'll get the username and also the password. And if the user doesn't provide any username and the password, we'll send them a JSON response saying that, oh, you forgot the password. And then this is where the magic happens. We import authenticate from Django contribute the authenticate auth package. And then the authenticate, login, and logout function will handle the user authentication for us, which is very neat. So if we simply call this will allow us to check whether the user is authenticated, which means that if the username and the password is stored in the user authentication system, if the user if it is valid, then it will return a user object containing all the detail for that user. And if the user is not valid, like for instance, their password is not correct, it will return null. If we receive a null, we'll simply return null credentials saying their password or their username is not correct. No sense that we actually don't return like your password is not correct or your username is not correct. We don't want to give the user or the attacker too many information. As a result, we only want to like return invalid credentials. So yeah. And after we log in the user, after we authenticate the user, then we need to log them in. The logging function is also a built-in function from the auth package, which is pretty nice. We simply pass in the request and then the user, and this will log the user in. And as a result, we'll pass, after the function return, we will return the JSON response successfully logging back to the front end to like explain to the front end that the user is successfully logged in. Any question for the logging view so far?
Oh, wait, just wondering, where is all the like user information stored?
Yeah, so
Is it
essentially,
stored?
yeah, it will be stored. It's handled by the Django like user authentication system itself. So it's actually not stored inside a database. It's stored in a file system. I don't actually know like where they're stored because it's like Django source code stuff.
Oh, okay. So then are there like
Yeah.
Django functions for when you create a user and then it just deals with it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see.
And later we'll show like, so you might notice that we actually don't have like a sign up view. That's because we are going to create our user inside our admin page. I think it will be clearer after a minute. Yeah. Cool. So this is the logging view. And now let's look at the logout view. So for the logout view, it's pretty simple. So essentially, we first of all, we check whether the current request user is authenticated, and then if the user object that's passing is authenticated, and then we simply return you are not logged in because you are essentially logged out. And then, oh, I mean, if it is not authenticated, then we return you are not logged in. Simply because if you haven't logged in, you can really log out. And if the user is authenticated, then we log out the request. And after we run logout request, the Django, oops, okay, sorry about that. After we log out the request, after we run logout request, the Django authentication system will actually log out the user correspond to that request. And then the user session will be expired and then will return successfully logged out. So that's for the, yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. So in login view, why is there data equals JSON.loads request.body, but then we don't have that for logout view or any of the other functions?
Yeah, so essentially why do we having for the login view is that we need to get the username and the password. However, for the logout and the, for instance, all the other view, all the data will be stored actually here, request or user.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that
And
makes sense.
yeah, so for this, we actually also access request body, but here will actually, the user will actually be storing another place. It's storing request or user. So yeah. This is
Thank you.
just like some convention that we trust the front end people to follow. So yeah, cool. So this is for the logout view. And for the session view, it's also pretty simple. Essentially, session view is for us to check whether the session is expired or not. Essentially, if the user has a session, which means that if the user session is not like expired, and then the user will send a session view request, And then to check whether the session view is authenticated, we'll simply ask the Django auth package whether the user is authenticated or not. If it is authenticated, then we will return true. If not, we'll return false. And simply also for the who am I view, this is just a view for us to play around. If the user is not authenticated, we return is authenticated false, and otherwise we'll simply return the username as a way to show that who the user is. So yeah. And this is all the views. These are all the views. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. So here's the view code, and which is like where all the meat happens actually. And from now we will just like clean things up a little bit and also add in some configuration. So first of all, we need to add a urls.py file to API. Let's see, so API URL. And this way we ensure that when we send out requests, we can actually redirect them to the proper view. Essentially, like when the user visit login, they will be redirected to this function, and all the view function is imported from here, from the views.py file. And after we have the URLs within the API, we also need to connect it to the main URL here. So let's do that right now. So besides admin, we also include the API, and we also need to include. Cool. And afterwards, so before we run this, let's actually add some setting. So these are some cookie settings that allows us to connect. It actually allows us to connect to the front end. Let's add it here. True. Cool. Oops. Okay. And now let's try to run migrate and create user to make sure that all the settings is properly configured. And note that we also need to create our super user because we are going to use the super user to add more users in. Email address, password. Cool. This time we use some proper password instead of like password. Okay, and we already have this. Oh yeah, finally to connect the backend with the front end, all we need to do is to provide a static URL and also the directory to the URL to the static directory. So this is what we need to add. And also some like template engine that we are going to use. So let's add it here. Okay, so here's a question in chat. What's the difference between make migrations and migrate, and how often is it necessary? So usually make migration, I would say you seldom use make migrations in real life. Usually you will only use migrate. Make migrations, I think we will only use it in some like very specific situation, but usually we just use Python.py migrate. Migrate will help us, for instance, handle the user authentication and also handle the database update. I think the only time when we need to run make migrations is when we first initialize the database. So yeah. And let's see, now we have the static URL, so let's delete that. Cool. Oh, and also let's create an index view for our application. What does this mean is that we essentially need to register the React URL as our front page. And this way, when the user visit our localhost, like the root URL, it will be redirected to this React page instead of like showing displaying error. So let's do that. And cool. Wait, why is it? Okay, fine. I'll just add it this way. Maybe that's pretty weird. Wait, why is it all my spaces messing? From Django, URLs include Django focus and oops. Okay, from Django. Okay. And now I think we got this. Cool, great. And yeah, what this will do is you will match the root URL to the React folder, to the front-end folder. So let's see. And now we should be able to run this. So let's run it. As you can see, it will run the server at 8,000. And cool. As you can see here, we successfully have our React page show up, which is a great sign. However, if we try to log in, as you can see, it's not really logging properly. What we need to do is actually go to the admin page. Let's see if I remember my password. Oh, nice. Okay. And then we go to user, and this is the kind of like the Django admin system. I think we also showed this during our last lecture. But essentially, how do you add users? Essentially, you click here, add user, and then username, for instance, test user. I'll just call it. Okay. Save. Cool. Let's just more. Yeah, this way we have successfully created a test user. Notice that here, the password is actually showing, instead of like the actual password that we have just created, it's actually showing a bunch of like other stuff. And what this is essentially saying that this is the algorithm that's used to hash the password. And what's the iterations is the number of times that the algorithm has been performed on itself, which means it's hashed once, and then it will hash it again, and it's hashed this many times. And what's a salt? Salt is essentially a thing that's being added to the end of the password. This is just used to ensure that the user's password is not too weak. So yeah. Oh, there's a question in chat. So it's saying, and if you made your own front-end file, then you will insert a relative path there, right? Yeah, totally. Yeah. So there are essentially two ways that you can create a front-end file. The first way is, the recommended way is by doing this. So make all the front-end file in a separate folder, include by using the static URL and also the join path. And the other way is to use the Django default template system. Feel free to check it out here. So Django templates, and then go to templates. Django template is very similar to HTML. It's also a pretty neat way to write HTML code, or like to write front-end code. However, we are going to use React because this is what all the front engineers are learning these days, and also which you will be learning in our front-end primer courses. So yeah, and yeah, so this is our password, and you can also add more personal information later. And this is just a bunch of random stuff. And yeah, and now let's try to log in with this test user. So let's go back to this page. Oops, it just said you are logged out. You're logging. So let's try to log in again. So wait, what's the username again? It's okay, it's test user. Let's log out. Test user. Okay. Yeah, as you can see, after we type our credential in, it says that you are successfully logged in. And also there's a who am I method. Let's try this out. So after we click who am I, as you can see, it print out you are logged in as test user in the console. And though this is only printing one line out in the console, this is showing that we have successfully like conduct front and backend, which means that the front end can successfully like query the backend user authentication system and then fetch the username. Oh yeah, thanks for the reminder in chat. Test user, yeah. I'm glad that I didn't forget the password. Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, this is for the cookie authentication system, and then we can log out again. And yeah. And I think that's it. Yeah. And if you want to get the front-end code, you can feel free to go to this resources. This lesson is essentially made from this resource. That's pretty nice. So yeah, feel free to take a look. Any questions?
This is kind of a small question, but how come every time you like reloaded it, you had to log out again? When you were
That's
like,
pretty. Yeah, I don't know about that, to be honest. We can actually try that again. Let's try that. I feel like let's see. Test user. Oh wait, test hyphen user. Okay. And then we refresh. Okay, if we hit refresh, it's not like logged out. And the reason why after we hit refresh, it's not logged out is that this is actually something to do with the front end code. Essentially, the front end will send a session request to the backend. I think we can actually see this here. Yeah. So after we hit refresh, it will send a session request to the backend, and then the backend will return like whether the user is authenticated or not to the front end, and that's why we can keep logged in. So yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question, but it's not really related to this.
Okay.
The way that you showed us that they were storing the password in your admin page, is that like an industry standard? Like the way that they use an algorithm to change it up and then hash it and add something like append something to the end?
Yeah. go take CS 161 if you're interested in this. They cover like super detail in hashing and how do you store algorithm. I'm actually taking 161. Essentially, why you add a salt is hacker can actually hack the very commonly used password many times as well, and they can generate like a hash table. We call it like rainbow table, and then they can like match the rainbow table to the all the password that the user have like created. And usually some user will be lazy and they will just create a very simple password. And if we don't have a salt, then the rainbow table will directly have a match between the password and then the rainbow table. As a result, the password will be explored. So.
No, thank you.
Yeah, if you're interested in this, definitely take 161. It's a very interesting course.
Is it being taught by Weaver?
Yeah. The most active professor on Reddit. Cool. I think we will end our lecture recording now.